In Britain, a child dies at the hands of a parent once every 10 days.
Baby P was taken to
But in 2007, one child's death sparked a media frenzy and a huge public outcry. His death was blamed on the social workers and shattered our confidence in the profession's ability to protect children.
I can't believe they didn't spot it. They must go. All those who are responsible have to go.
I'd stack them all, mate, and put them all in the big field and burn them.
Now, 7 years on, the people at the centre of the scandal are prepared to reveal a much more complex picture. It's a story about clues that nobody picked up on. How all the agencies failed to protect baby P.
The child was so vulnerable, and the police, the social workers, the health people, we missed it. We missed it and we missed it.
It's about the consequences for those who were named and shamed.
The papers said Maria Ward, the most hated woman in Britain. I don't even have the words, really, to describe how awful things became.
And it's about how one child's death became a high-stakes political blame game.
It's about a social services department that gets £100 million a year and can't look after children. That's what this is about.
I knew what was going to happen immediately was there was going to be pressure for action. Something must be done.
This is the untold story of baby P. And why we never heard it. On the 3rd of August 2007, an ambulance was called to a house in North London, where paramedics found the lifeless body of a 17-month-old boy.
My deputy came through the door and she said, "We've got a little boy who's dead this morning, and we know him. We know him. He's one of our children. He's on our child protection register."
Because he died from abuse, Sharon Shoesmith notified the government, and a serious case review was set up to inquire into his death. The child's mother, her boyfriend and his brother were arrested and charged. While prosecutors began to build a case against them, 2 independent experts were appointed to carry out the review. It would be their 29th investigation.
What is so sad is that actually the circumstances of Peter Connolly and his death were not that unusual to us. We had done a lot of serious case reviews by then, so there wasn't any particular feature about the case that would have given us pause for thought.
In November, 3 months after Peter's death, Carmi began work on the serious case review. She met with representatives from the agencies involved with child protection in Haringey, including Haringey's Children's Services, the Metropolitan Police and Great Ormond Street Hospital, which managed the borough's paediatric staff. Eddie quickly learned the basic facts of the case. In December 2006, 9-month-old Peter was taken to hospital with unexplained bruising and put on the child protection register. He was removed from the family home, and his grandmother and 25-year-old mother, Tracy, were arrested on suspicion of assault. After initial police inquiries failed to find proof of abuse or identify a perpetrator, Peter was returned home. In February, social workers handed the case over to a second child protection team. They described Tracy as a loving mother, struggling to supervise her children properly. In one of the most deprived boroughs in London, the case didn't appear to pose an unusually high risk.
Sometimes it's so obvious, sometimes there's such poor care, parents completely wasted on drugs and drink, horrendous injuries, disclosures of sexual abuse, terrible, terrible living conditions, pure neglect. Those are the easy ones. Tracy appeared to be a loving, caring mum. The home was relatively okay, the children got to school, things were being tackled and done, but she was herself saying, you know, she needed some help. She accepted that and was wanting to work with Maria and others.
Maria Ward, one of Haringey's most respected social workers, was assigned to the Connolly family. She began meeting with Tracy, recently separated and struggling as a single mother to Peter and his siblings.
I would go and do visits. She would explain what had gone on, you know, since I'd last visited. I'd speak to the children. I'd speak to the children alone. Peter was a very active child. You knew he was in the room. He would run around, touching things he shouldn't. I'd observed her cuddle Peter. I'd observed Peter go to her, to be comforted by her. Caring for him, you know, changing his nappy, you know, giving him food, you know, the normal.
Social workers, police and health professionals saw Peter and his family more than 60 times in the 8 months between Peter's first hospital visit and his death. None realised the significance of a man who had entered Tracy's life. His name was Stephen Barker.
Level boy.
Tracy, she did love her children. I'll give her that. Because when she was with them sometimes on her own, and she used to make little picnics in this kitchen because they had a big kitchen, and she used to bring them to the park, and yeah, she did love them. But I have to be honest, it's more or less, I'm not blaming this idiot Stephen Barker, not blaming him, but I am blaming in a way. It's only since he came that she got so engrossed in him that she took her eye off the ball when it comes to the little one.
The family home was visited repeatedly by social workers, health visitors and other professionals. Eddie Carmi at the Serious Case Review was determined to find out how all of them, and the police, had overlooked the boyfriend and missed other clues that might have helped save Peter's life.
This was the most difficult review I have ever undertaken by far. The defensiveness between the different agencies, the wish between each agency to throw blame on the other and to try and work out this whole thing about identifying where's the blame, which agency got it really wrong. You would ask for information, but you'd only get a little bit. You weren't getting the full story, you were getting bits of it. We began to realise what a high-profile case this was, that actually what you were dealing with was people scared about their jobs.
It would take Eddie 9 months to complete the Serious Case Review, the longest investigation of her career. The government would be kept informed throughout. While Eddie worked on her review, Haringey Council carried out its own separate investigation into its social workers.
On several occasions, we wept together just reading some of the things that we were being told were happening to that little boy, and we were just quite horrified by it. The child was so vulnerable, and we missed it. All of us, the police, the social workers, the health people, all of those health agencies, you could just go through it again and again. If only this, if only that. Yeah, we missed it. We missed it and we missed it.
Haringey Council found no evidence of gross misconduct by the social workers. They received written warnings for procedural failings.
I remember on occasion speaking to another director of children's services. I said we weren't going to sack the social workers, and he was aghast. He straight away said, "Whoa, how are you going to steer this through if you're not going to sack the social workers?" And I did think, yeah, I understand that comment, but there is no evidence, and I'm not going to make it up.
The public were oblivious to these closed-door deliberations, but the agencies involved knew that once word got out, their actions would face intense scrutiny. Peter had died in the borough where 8 years earlier The death of another child, Victoria Climbier, had forced a national overhaul of child protection. For months, Haringey officials planned for the inevitable day the story would break. And who would face the press? They chose Sharon Shoesmith, whose high-flying career as an educator, administrator and former Ofsted inspector meant she could manage crises.
We completely trusted Sharon. Sharon was extremely good. She was very used to doing public events. We had no reason to think that Sharon was not the ideal person.
The police decided to handle the press on their own. So Sharon teamed up with Jane Collins, the chief executive of Great Ormond Street Hospital. They and their advisors developed a strategy.
There was always a view that we should speak directly with the press. We should meet the press and we should tell them what happened. Our plans were always along the theme of being honest. We knew this little boy very well, and we weren't going to hide from that.
On the morning of November the 11th, Sharon was told that the verdict in the trial of Peter's mother, her boyfriend and his brother would be delivered that day. The press conference would begin 2 hours later. It would be the start of 3 tumultuous weeks that would spark a feeding frenzy by the press, set off a storm in Westminster and throw the child protection system into a state of crisis.
Great aunt in 2000.
Yes, and this makes it acutely embarrassing, of course, for that council. Indeed, I think they are holding a press conference later, we understand, in conjunction with Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital, where this case was referred to.
I was very well rehearsed, as was Jane Collins, Chief Executive of Great Ormond Street. But I was very apprehensive. I was incredibly apprehensive. I was fearful, is really, if I'm honest, I was fearful of it.
Now, and 2 men have been found guilty at the Old Bailey of causing or allowing the death of a 17-month-old child.
For the jury and everyone else involved, this has been the most harrowing of cases imaginable. The repeated abuse and eventual death of a vulnerable young child.
The journalists who'd witnessed the trial were amazed that prosecutors had failed to secure a murder conviction, despite the catalogue of injuries. And frustrated they could not identify 2 of the 3 perpetrators because they faced another trial.
The child's mother consistently lied in an attempt to conceal the ill treatment of him and avoided the assistance that she was offered by professionals to help protect him from harm. She repeatedly chose to mislead.
The facts were so shocking. There were 50 injuries. The police had investigated this family.
The police could have done a better job, and I am hugely sorry that we couldn't do better.
This boy had been seen by doctors. In fact, a doctor had examined him just before his death and not spotted a broken back.
St Anne's Hospital with fractured ribs, missing nails and what's now believed to have been a broken back.
We wanted to know how could this happen when social services had been involved with the family. People had to be held to account.
We expected about maybe 12 people, but it was packed.
The sheer numbers of injuries over such a long time to such a little creature made the atmosphere a little bit like a lynch mob. There was a feeling that in the air that somebody was going to get it.
I read my prepared piece and Jane read hers. And then it was open for questions.
People smelt blood. We weren't able to name Tracy Connolly, we weren't able to name Stephen Barker, we weren't able to show their photos, so who was going to be next in line for blame?
The questions straight away were very hostile. They were naming social workers. Had I sacked this person? Who else had I sacked? And of course, when I said that investigations have been carried out and there wasn't the evidence to sack anyone, they were absolutely going for it. I was just pulled in all sorts of directions. The homing in on me was absolutely palpable, whereas Jane Collins was able to read her piece, say a few things and slip away.
I've just come from a briefing held by Haringey Council and the Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital. Now, Haringey Council, of course, it's very embarrassing for them because this is the same borough where Victoria Climbier was killed 8 years ago and whose death led to the
This toddler was on the Child Protection
reform
Register in the North London borough of Haringey. Some of the details of this case are highly distressing, in particular injuries.
At a media briefing, the head of Children's Services refused to say sorry.
Seemed to be this obsession that we hadn't said we were sorry.
Child Protection Register, they knew that this baby was at significant risk.
And we all felt that the press was not interpreting what we were feeling in Haringey, and in particular how sorry and sad we were about the tragic death of this child. They seemed to have this impression that we were totally heartless.
Once again, a small child has been killed right under the noses of social workers.
Received dozens of visits from social workers. But Haringey Council said today that there would be no sackings or resignations.
Indeed, 2 days before he died, he was actually seen by a consultant in a hospital, and yet still no one seemed to have spotted what was happening.
Time's 13 minutes past 6. We can take a look at papers now. Several of them, the Times, Guardian, Sun, lead on that sad story of baby
taking
P.
responsibility for the death of baby P. One MP, Lynn Featherstone, says
The next morning, the media focused not on the 3 people responsible for causing the child's death, but on the professionals whose job it had been to protect him.
When I first saw the headline from The Sun, blood on their hands, I just didn't understand it. I didn't really understand it. And it didn't take long for me to realise where they were going with the story, what they were saying.
Serious flaws in the child protection system have again been exposed by the violent death.
How could social workers get it so wrong?
social workers and a lawyer, but nobody's resigned. That seems extraordinary. No one's taking the blame.
Shortly after midday, a story that had begun the day on the front pages of the newspapers was suddenly the very centre of a political conflict.
Let's be honest, this is a story about a 17-year-old girl who had no idea how to bring up a child. It's about a boyfriend who couldn't read but could beat a child. And it's about a social services department that gets £100 million a year and can't look after children. That's what this is about. Will the Prime Minister, I don't expect an answer now, you never get one, but will he at least consider whether time has come to take over this failing department and put someone in charge who can run it properly for our children?
I just remember thinking, it's so irresponsible to get your facts wrong. He referred to the mother as a teenage mum. In fact, she was 28, but it suited his narrative for this to be a teenage, feckless mother receiving, support from the state, almost certainly, abusing a child, symbolic of broken Britain, and it was clearly done in a managed and planned way, because a piece appeared in the Evening Standard simultaneously with Prime Minister's questions to make the same argument. I knew what was going to happen immediately was there was going to be pressure for action. Something must be done, and I couldn't be seen to be brushing the issue under the carpet.
It was a genuinely dramatic argument in the House of Commons about a genuinely appalling and moving story.
Vince Cable, what did you make of these exchanges?
When I came out of the chamber, I saw the front page of the Evening Standard, where a story had clearly been planted that here was David Cameron leading the charge of the indignant public in a way that was implicitly highly political.
Waiting still for Ed Balls to make a formal statement on the next step in this tragic, distressing case, which is
all
now...
those responsible have to go. Social worker went into that property and more than on one occasion and saw the every other mother. I'm just absolutely horrified. Where were the professionals? And we've heard a lot of...
By late afternoon, the story was impossible to ignore.
The horrific killing has led to profound national soul-searching. And this afternoon, the government responded with an announcement that Haringey's children's services are to be investigated.
The thing I want to do now is to ask the independent experts, which is Ofsted, the Health Commission, and also the Inspector of Police, to look in the next fortnight in detail at exactly what happened in Haringey, to look right across the piece, report back to me, so that I can learn the lessons and take whatever action is needed to make sure this can't happen again in Haringey and all around the country.
The Secretary of State had commissioned a quick turnaround inspection of all of Haringey's child protection services in social care, police and health.
I was trying to move this out of the political realm and into the control of the independent inspectorates, independent of politics. I was very fearful of where politics would take this.
Prompted by the widespread public revulsion at the case of baby P and under mounting political pressure, the government has moved to take...
It was a real public outrage, fed to some extent, obviously, by ourselves and the newspapers. But they had good reason to be outraged. It was a horrendous case. Cab drivers, people you meet in the street, people in the pubs, it's what they were talking about. How could this happen? Who's to blame? They all wanted somebody to blame.
I'm absolutely disgusted with these people in Haringey. Are they
with the situation that's happened previously, that lessons would have been learned, and obviously they haven't.
There must be something wrong. And personally,
A child dies every 10 days in this country at the hands of a parent, and 1 in 10 of these are on the Child Protection Register. But Peter had died in Haringey, where a previous high-profile child death had led to fundamental changes to safeguarding children. Across the country, local departments for education and children's social care had been merged under the leadership of a single director of children's services. In Haringey, Sharon Shoesmith, the borough's highly regarded director of education, had been offered the post. In her new job, Sharon was responsible for the welfare of the borough's 53,000 children, including more than 700 who were either in care or on the Child Protection Register.
The number one greatest risk for any council, and of course for Haringey, was the death of a child that we knew. That was the number one risk. And I was always aware of that. I used to stand on the 5th floor of the council building, and I could look right across Tottenham. I would often stand there and just look out across all those rows and rows of homes and children and hope that social workers out there made the right decisions.
The buck doesn't seem to have stopped with anybody here. Nobody's put their hand up. Nobody is taking responsibility.
Visited twice. I thought that would have been enough, but like 60 times, that's ridiculous.
Haringey Social Services should be resigning right now.
It's not the first time it's happened in that area, is it really? You know, would anybody be brave enough to stand up and take responsibilities and accountability for the appalling situation that's happened?
I managed to get hold of a photograph. It wasn't just a photograph of Peter. It was a photograph of Peter looking just absolutely like a beautiful, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, angelic-looking little boy. This little boy suddenly became real. This is this little human being who was tortured to death. I think when people saw that image, it made them even angrier. And the Sun newspaper, of course, started this big campaign. They were on the front page pretty much every day. It was relentless.
There's been a rush of signatures to a petition organised by the Sun newspaper calling for the immediate sacking of all the social workers involved in Baby P's case, including Ms. Shoesmith.
65,000
all those are responsible have to
And I think they're failing their role of function. The children's lives are at risk if we get this wrong.
The Sun, like much of the media, had its facts wrong.
The petition was a complete lie, and the Sun knew that. The petition say that social workers made, 60 visits. When in actual fact, we'd already told the Sun in the material I had given at the press briefing, we'd 60 contacts with this child. 37 of those were health. About 17 or 18 of them were from social workers, and then the others were from various services. And whilst I wouldn't want to, say that absolves, us from anything. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that it was a blatant lie.
I'm shaking, I'm so cross about it. How can any social worker not notice when a child is that badly injured? I mean, it's obvious when
Social workers don't recognise a broken back or a swollen tooth or, bone fractures. How can they see when a kid is genuinely distressed?
The Children's Secretary, Ed Balls, has promised a thorough and wide-ranging examination of procedures in Haringey. The boy, known as Baby P, suffered horrific injuries.
A few days after that spat in the Commons, things really took off, absolutely in a different direction. Outside our offices, we were surrounded, absolutely surrounded. The place was completely covered in media. The whole council was swamped with hate mail. My department was inundated with emails. We were just completely snowed under.
From the top to the bottom, everyone should lose their jobs, and let's start again.
Poor baby. What the hell is the matter with the social workers?
A year earlier, before Baby P became a household name, Eddie Carmi at the Serious Case Review had heard from all the agencies and had begun to piece together how Peter had fallen through the cracks.
The reports from each agency usually give a fairly polished overview of what each agency has done and perhaps not recognising or skirting over some of the issues, and some of them only become apparent when you put it together. You work through very slowly and painstakingly the inconsistencies, and then you go back and you ask more questions, digging deeper and deeper to try and understand.
Eddie was particularly curious about the last contact Peter had had with the authorities, just 2 days before he died. It wasn't with a social worker, but with a doctor.
I wanted to look at what had happened with regard to the paediatrician's appointment in August 2007. At that point, I did not know who the paediatrician was. I discovered in later media reports that this is Dr. Al-Zayat.
We were junior doctors in our mid-20s, full of enthusiasm. And there she was, Saba, a desert girl from Saudi Arabia. Soon after our wedding, we were in London, actually, walking alongside Great Ormond Street Hospital. Saba said, "I wish one day I can work here." And I said, "In your dreams, Saba, this is not the place where people like us would ever get a job." And what I meant was these were iconic institutions. We had seen them in the pictures. These were institutions which were beyond us, which probably took the best of the English. I was abroad when I got an email from Saba that there was some locum post in with Great Ormond Street Hospital, and I said, "Go for it." Within a week or two, she had got the job. She was over the moon. Sky was the limit. She had managed to be in a place that we thought was beyond our approach, and she was, and it was all on her own merit. I mean, that was beautiful. That's what we thought it was.
But Dr. Al-Zayat's temporary job wasn't at Great Ormond Street in central London, but 5 miles away at St Anne's Hospital in Haringey. It was here that Saba would examine Peter Connolly 2 days before his death. In the wake of Victoria Climbier's death, paediatricians wouldn't work in Haringey. The world-renowned Great Ormond Street Hospital stepped in and agreed to recruit and manage the borough's medical staff. It was able to attract a new generation of doctors eager to improve services for Haringey's children.
It was very, very chaotic. The appointments were all over the place. People were turning up
who haven't got appointments, and then other children should have appointments, haven't got them.
If you were to do a clinic related to child safeguarding, often you were just given a piece of blank paper. You had to start your clinic with perhaps just the parent who might be the perpetrator of the alleged abusive incident and the child. We had no access to the IT system. There was no information whatsoever available. So if a child who had a bruise on the body and you were asked to examine him or her, one wouldn't have access to any information about the past child's life story at all.
We were new, we were thinking, they've asked us to come down here to look at what's wrong within the service. We'll start to highlight these things, we'll start to document them. You know, we'll talk to the managers, we'll start to address them. I did not anticipate by any means what then followed.
Sharon Shoesmith has come under increasing pressure this week after the death of 17-month-old baby
Child,
P.
18 months old, apparently was seen by a doctor who failed to spot the child had a broken back.
It does seem quite extraordinary.
Where serious mistakes are made, there must be accountability, and I will not hesitate to act on the findings of what went wrong in
Less than a week after the story broke, the emergency inspection of Haringey's Child Protection Services, ordered by Ed Balls, began.
You look at this and just think, how could a mum, how could adults do this to a child? I can't change that. And in the case of Haringey, I can't change what seems to have been the mistakes which happened. I've got the inspectors in at the moment. They're going to report back to me in 2 weeks' time. And at that point,
Inspections would normally take 5 months. This one would be done in 2 weeks.
It was a kind of crazy thing to do, to try to launch an inspection in that time frame. You know, anyone would have known that. The inspectors themselves would have known that. That would have been quite crazy to do that. But at the same time, I thought, OK, if that's what we're going to do. I went into the inspection feeling quite confident about what the outcome would be.
Ofsted and other inspectors had given Haringey increasingly positive assessments in Shoesmith's time as director, and had praised her leadership. Now, these same services were being called an utter disgrace, calling into question Ofsted's reliability.
We know that in March, the inspectors said that Haringey had to improve, and then in October, and this is just after baby P had died, provides a good service for children.
The inquiry that takes place over a period of just 2 weeks is going to be inadequate in getting to the bottom of these issues.
I was concerned the confidence of child protection across the country was in doubt and at risk. And once it moved into the debate about the integrity of the inspection process, the questions being asked weren't just about Haringey, they were happening in every part of the country. So, you know, that was the world we were in. And I had no choice. I mean, I couldn't. There was no kind of rewind. You know, there had been a court case. It had come to a terrible end. There had been the Prime Minister's questions politicisation. There had been a huge public anger and upset, and I had to manage that situation. And that's just where we were.
A few months into her review, Eddie Carmi had learned enough to conclude that Peter Connolly's case was like most she'd encountered in her 22-year career.
In my experience, what is common in every single serious case review is the fact that every agency has mistakes, and it's just when they all happen at the same time and there's no one agency, no one practitioner actually seeing what is happening to the child.
By February 2007, when social worker Maria Ward had inherited the case, there had already been more than a dozen contacts with Peter and his family since his hospital visit 2 months earlier. Maria's colleagues had believed Tracy Connolly to be a well-intentioned mother, and with the police unable to prove abuse or identify a perpetrator, Peter had been allowed home while their investigation continued. Within a few weeks of being given the case, Maria received a tip-off. There was a man in Tracy's life, a possible boyfriend. She quickly followed it up.
I raised this issue with Tracy. She said, no, I don't have a boyfriend. It's just a friend that comes sometimes in the house to do work in the house, that's all. It's not a boyfriend. I'd never observed a boyfriend in the house. None of the family friends had mentioned the boyfriend. At the time, I didn't feel I was taken in by Tracy. At the time, she was another parent that I was working with. She always gave the appearance of being cooperative. She never kind of said to me, you can't come round, you're not seeing my children, you're not seeing my children alone. So in a way, she did give the appearance of being cooperative. She turned up at the conferences, she turned up at all the core group meetings. Some parents wouldn't do that.
I don't like having people interfering all the time. I don't mean that in a horrible way. I know that the social workers are there for a job, and I know they're there for a purpose. And at the end of all this, I hope they will back off and leave me alone and see that I am an okay mother. Does that make sense?
She was brilliant how she could manipulate people. She comes across really genuine. Everything she says. She even manipulated me in some ways. She's very deceiving. I used to call her, I said, you're like Auntie Etna, a snake. And what you see and what you hear is two different things, and that's the God honest truth.
In April 2007, Peter was taken to hospital again with bruising. Doctors accepted Tracy's explanation that Peter had hit his head on the fireplace while playing with another child. He was allowed home. By now, the professionals working on his case had been thinking that there might be a more innocent explanation for his bruising.
This is a case which starts with a diagnosis of bruising, some of which was thought to be non-accidental. But what happens is, because they never establish how it happened and who did the bruising, they become seen as having occurred through neglect and that a child isn't being supervised properly. And that's what happened in this case.
As the weeks passed and with no word from the police, yet another possible explanation emerged for his injuries.
The social worker, doctors, health visitors saw the child throw himself around energetically, injuring himself and bruising himself and hurting himself. Therefore, the case became reinterpreted over time, and that became what people had in their head and what they worked with.
To rule out a natural cause for Peter's bruising, a health visitor had been asked to set up a paediatric assessment for him at St Anne's. When her request was rejected, Maria Ward took the initiative.
I wrote a letter to St Anne's requesting Peter have a paediatric assessment, and I put in the letter the history, what our concerns were, the fact that Peter was subject to a child protection plan, why he was subject to a child protection plan, and I sent the referral off.
With still no word from the police or the hospital, Maria continued to monitor Peter. Then in June, she made an unannounced visit to his home.
I noticed just something on Peter's face. The lighting wasn't too good in the room, and I kind of asked Tracy about Peter's face. And as Peter got up and started walking around, Tracy had said that he had a squabble with her friend's child, and her friend's child had hit him in the face with a particular toy.
Unconvinced, Maria notified the police and took Peter to hospital, where for a second time his bruising was diagnosed as probable abuse. A police officer and a senior social services manager disagreed about what to do. Initially, the police wanted Peter removed temporarily from the home, but accepted that he could remain if lawyers were consulted about the possibility of removing him and safeguards were put in place. Tracy would not be allowed to be alone with her son. He was supposed to be with a childminder during the day, and a family friend would monitor him at home. While the police launched a second investigation, social workers chased St Anne's to finally rule out any other explanation.
We needed to find out if there was a medical reason for Peter's behaviour, what was actually going on, and really to, help make decisions around his care, really. We wanted to kind of understand what was actually happening. Peter received an appointment in August, and I think I'd sent the referral off in April or May.
Peter's appointment would be at an institution where staffing, once again, was a problem. The doctors recruited by Great Ormond Street Hospital had tried to get management to listen to their concerns, but with little success. 2 of the doctors decided to leave.
Things were getting out of control. 2 good people are leaving. It's going to leave 2 of us. That's going to be even worse. They didn't want to leave us in the lurch, so they said, look, we need to put something down because this is really becoming very scary, and we're leaving. It's going to leave 2 of you. It's going to be much more difficult for the 2 of you. We've still got all these issues like the no notes and all that sort of thing. So let's write a letter.
The letter was sent to managers at St Anne's and Great Ormond Street.
We did see a definite change in the way how managers started to respond to us. There was more hostility. It was almost like more fault finding rather than finding solutions.
Although a report found this did not add up to bullying, Warrior left in October 2006. 4 months later, Kim Holt went on stress-related sick leave. By the time Peter Connolly was examined in August 2007, only 1 permanent consultant remained and 1 locum, Dr. Saba Al-Zayat.
I was absolutely terrified that something was going to go wrong. The service shouldn't have stayed open. I really don't. I mean, it just wasn't. It just was not safe. It was not safe.
The story which just won't go away. Headlines about baby P dominate the front pages.
50 injuries despite being seen by social workers over 60 times.
10 days on from the story breaking, and with Ed Balls' emergency inspection underway, there was little sign of the public pressure going away.
Each time we thought we'd probably broadcast as much as we could, the papers would come up with something again, so we'd end up telling it in a different way, and even my own office couldn't get enough of the story. And that sounds terrible, but it seemed that the public wanted answers, and until they got their answers, people just wanted to keep this alive.
A social worker going into that situation, I can't believe they didn't spot it. They must be dense.
A disastrous, ghastly episode, and I want to see Head's role in Haringey Social Services.
Incredibly angry, absolute arrogance. And I just get very angry, mate, because I've got a little boy of my own, and I just stack them all, mate. I make them all homeless and put them all in a big field and burn them.
I left my house and I was only going to be gone for a week. And I never went back. I couldn't go back. I was told that some people had come to the house wanting to beat me up. I just kind of thought, how can you return there? It's just, you just never know what's going to happen. It's just never going to feel safe again.
The person who had been coaching me for the press conference rang me. Only in the week before, she had done some trial interviews with me. She said to me, get out of London, change your name, go somewhere in Essex, buy somewhere else, get your head down and start all over again. Because there is no way out of this.
It had taken several months, but Eddie Carmi at the Serious Case Review had filled in the details of most of Peter's contacts with child protection agencies and could begin to formulate her conclusions.
There were problems with the performance of every agency and every professional from my perspective. What this case was about was a cumulative effect of lots and lots of mistakes, shortcomings in practice, that each one in themselves would not have made a major difference, but it's when you put them together, and when you put together the fact that they were happening in every agency.
For Eddie, this was particularly true in the last months of Peter's life, when everything seemed to change.
In June, there was a change in Mum's behaviour. Peter's presentation, how he looks, changes, and his weight goes down, as does a sibling's weight go down. So it looks as if in those 2 months something different is happening in this household. When I asked social care what happened in June, why did certain things not happen, the response was that at that point in time that area was inundated and other cases seemed higher priority.
By summer 2007, Maria Ward was directly responsible for 18 children, 50% more than the recommended limit. Her increased workload coincided with a critical change in the Connolly household. Stephen Barker's brother Jason Owen moved in, and Peter's condition worsened. In the last month of his life, Peter was seen 8 times by health professionals, including a GP, a health visitor, and at A&E. No one sounded the alarm. Eddie had struggled to understand how this could be possible. She'd remained troubled by one of those contacts, Al Zayat's examination of Peter. 2 experts were asked to investigate. Their findings would feed into the serious case review.
I was asked by Great Ormond Street to examine the conduct of the doctor involved, who was called Dr. Al Zayat, and to see whether her work was appropriate and she'd done the correct things. We had an interview with the doctor in charge. The first thing she said when we came to see her, she said, "You have to understand, this is a clinically risky situation." And that we were sort of gobsmacked by this, really. It was very, very strange. And then she told us how there were only 2 consultants and one of them was Dr. Al Zayat when there should have been 4. The referral from the social worker was actually 3 months old. The social worker wanted to exclude organic causes of disease for the difficulties that baby Peter had been having. And I think Dr. Al Zayat focused on looking for an organic cause. She did note down the injuries. There were numerous bruises on the back and there were bruises on the face as well. Both sites which would be very suggestive of child abuse. But she didn't come to any clear diagnosis. And she didn't understand that the way of dealing with this kind of child, if there was any doubt, was to make sure the child was in a place of safety. And so the whole thing could be properly investigated. On the other hand, there were no notes available. There was no nurse in the clinic to help weigh the child or do anything of that sort. Or more importantly, to be somebody to help in the decision-making processes on whether the child needed protection. Looking at a child in the dark like this was very, very difficult, even for the most experienced doctor. I looked her up in the GMC website, and I found that she wasn't on the specialist register, which absolutely amazed me. Dr. Al Zayat should not have been in that job. It wasn't fair to her, actually. She'd never taken a lead role in child protection. So she really had quite a small experience, quite inadequate to be a consultant paediatrician. And it doesn't really matter if you're a locum or a substantive post. You really shouldn't be appointed unless you have those qualifications.
2 months after her examination of Peter, Saba Al Zayat had received a glowing appraisal from Great Ormond Street Hospital. They went on to offer her a permanent consultant's post. But after Seibert submitted his report, the hospital withdrew its job offer and sacked her. 6 months later, she would join the social workers in the full glare of the media spotlight.
The child was seen by a doctor who failed to spot the child had a broken back.
Yeah, it does seem quite extraordinary.
But he said, how can somebody not notice when a child's got a broken back?
That was a doctor, though, not the social
All the remarks, comments passed by thousands of people on the internet are there for anyone to read. Suggestions to bring the death penalty back, to hang her. Those are remarks which my daughter read. My little girl used to ask me, Dad, why would they say such things about Mom? I had no answers.
Although Mr. Balls was careful not to prejudge the outcome of the independent inquiry, it's clear he believes there have been serious mistakes made by those involved in the Baby P case.
It was clearly a death threat when I came in the door, but it was properly addressed, and I suppose that was one of my biggest shocks, that it was properly addressed. Somebody knew I lived there, and it targeted my daughter. I just phoned the police. They took it very seriously indeed. They wanted her out of London the same night, and they wanted her escorted to the railway station and gone. Because they took it so seriously, I really got frightened, and that was the beginning of a real period of fear, very deep fear that I seemed to develop. And it became of everybody, it came of the press. So I became very frightened of the press, really frightened of them in an irrational way. So I would go into a whole process of shaking that I'd never experienced in my life before. Real uncontrollable shaking.
Just days before the emergency inspector's report was due, Secretary of State Ed Balls came under even more pressure.
Spoke to Rebecca Brooks, the editor of the newspaper, and she said that she wanted the petition to be received by me in Downing Street, and for me to be photographed receiving the petitions. And I refused. I said to her I wasn't going to do that. I thought it would be totally wrong. I knew what the petition said and what their motive was, and I wasn't going to play any part in that. I was going to do my job properly, and that meant refusing to receive a sudden petition. And she was very upset with me.
This is George Pascal Watson, the political editor of The Sun, here in Downing Street, where we have just delivered a petition of 1.2 million signatures from the British public and Sun readers about the case of Baby P.
She said that action should happen against Miss Shoesmith, and I said I wasn't going to have that conversation with her. That was a matter of the independent inspectors. That was not something that I was going to get involved in.
Five days later, the independent inspectors delivered their emergency report to Secretary of State Ed Balls. Haringey Council leaders were summoned to review its contents at 10 in the morning. Ed Balls' live news conference was scheduled for lunchtime.
We were told how we were not allowed to change it, we could only check for factual mistakes, and we were treated a bit like very naughty children, I felt. It was much more shocking than I had ever dreamt. It was so strongly worded. I remember being tearful at that stage. Everything was unsatisfactory. It was failing at all levels.
The political pressure on all of this is immense simply because the public reaction to it has been so immense. I actually went to the shrine at Islington Crematorium a few days ago.
It does appear as though resignations have happened already.
I deeply regret that we were not able to protect Baby P. And this baby's tragic life and death is a great sadness to me.
Ed Balls, Beverly Hughes, ready to take that press conference. That news conference starting now.
Overall, the inspectors' findings are, I have to say, devastating. And having studied their report, I've decided to take immediate action. My first priority is to put in place a new leadership and management team in Haringey Children's Services to ensure that vulnerable children in the borough are properly protected. And Haringey Council will now remove the current Director of Children's Services from her post with immediate effect.
I was sort of sitting at home watching it on the television. I was utterly shocked.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
A damning verdict on Haringey Council's childcare services.
I don't think I moved out of that chair until something like 10 o'clock that night.
Baby P was identified as being at risk and was then abandoned to his fate.
I was just there thinking, what on earth is this? Where have some of the things come from that he said?
Government ministers had known there were problems here in Haringey, but it wasn't until they saw this morning that they realised how bad the situation was.
Inadequate, unacceptable and poor. The word the minister who commissioned the report used was devastating.
19 minutes to 7, and let's look at the papers' main story. For most of them, The Sun, The Times, The Independent and The Guardian all lead on it. It's not enough.
Institutionalising competence in these local government departments.
Good morning. Children's services in England are to be monitored more closely. The hope is to avoid a repeat of the failings by social workers involved in the Baby P case in Haringey in North London.
The effect of Ed Balls' intervention was to close this story down.
Director of Children's Services from her post with immediate effect.
We had been given a narrative that this had been a catastrophic failure, negligence on the part of social workers. It was now something that we could begin to put behind us.
Chaotic litany of incompetence. Should Shoesmith
If they failed, then they failed and they shouldn't be kept on full
Inspectors
pay.
found a catalogue of failings in almost every area of Haringey's child protection services.
I couldn't help naturally thinking this has got to be a much more complex. It has to be. I suppose it is something anal in me, but I just increasingly got drawn into the case, and I suppose I was reading more and more of it.
The term Baby P has become a shorthand. Would say Baby P to some people, and they'll talk about social work incompetence. Others, lessons not being learned.
As Tim became more intrigued, the rest of the media moved on to Ofsted.
Calls for Ofsted inspectors to explain how they managed to give Haringey Council a good rating shortly after the death of Baby P.
Ofsted's report had found Haringey Council to be a failure at virtually every level. So how had the regulator awarded the same council a good grade in 2007, just months after Peter Connolly had died? Ofsted's chief inspector claimed that Haringey Council had misled the regulator by supplying faulty information.
Said actually the council had hidden behind false data.
48 hours later, citing the results of the emergency inspection, Haringey Council sacked Sharon Shoesmith.
Out of a job and no compensation.
Yes, it's one job loss. People won't be crying about it.
But for a few observers, the questions around the Ofsted inspection refused to go away. 2 days later, during its annual review of Ofsted, a parliamentary select committee was taken aback when two senior officials revealed what had happened to Haringey's faulty data.
Inspection information is only held for a certain amount of time for different... I'm not quite sure how long it's held for.
3 months after the end of after the publication of the report, or the final transactions, if there's any complaint about the report, all the evidence then is destroyed.
But you've destroyed the record. What's the evidence trail if you destroyed the record after 3 months? That would be like an academic writing an article and destroying all their research material. That's horrific, isn't it? I'd never heard that Ofsted records were destroyed after 3 months. Just that was a total new piece of information, and I'd been sitting there as chairman of the select committee for quite a few years, and I'd interviewed quite a few chief inspectors over that time, and I was deeply shocked.
This was a revelation that received virtually no media attention. For most people, the story was dead. Sharon Shoesmith had been sacked, The social workers would follow in a few months' time, and the doctor faced the prospect of being struck off the medical register. The country could return to normal.
To distance themselves and Stephen Gerrard from those comments to say, Laura,
Really, come on. Just use it as an opportunity to plug your business. Honestly, I would.
Tim Donovan, however, had been reviewing the coverage from when the story first broke. He was surprised that even though the police had acknowledged failings, few journalists had followed up.
To repeated abuse and eventual
death. The child's mother consistently lied in an attempt to conceal the ill treatment of him. The police could have done a better job, and I am hugely sorry that we couldn't do better. But
the police seemed to get away, if that's the right expression, without having to say very much publicly. They had to make a statement on the steps of the Old Bailey. But they didn't really have to spend much time justifying themselves or explaining their conduct. It was left to the others to face the detail, the anger of reporters at this press conference.
Tim wanted to know what the police failings had been. He managed to get copies of the unpublished serious case review and the police's own assessment of their performance. And there it was, in black and white, a catalogue of errors. In their first investigation, the police neglected to photograph Peter's injuries, didn't visit the home, and lost the case in the system for over 2 months. Most significantly, the police had largely ignored a lead they'd been given by other professionals and by Tracy Connolly herself, that she had a male friend who was helping her. His name was Steve.
It's not rocket science, of course. The presence of a stepfather figure or a man in the life of a child like this it's obvious. It must be one of the most fundamentally obvious things about investigating child abuse. But for some reason, there isn't evidence that police kind of thought about this or considered it.
The second investigation, launched after social worker Maria Ward's unannounced visit in June, followed a similar pattern. This time, the police took a week to photograph Peter's injuries and didn't question Tracy or her other children about who was living in the house, or, once again, whether there was a man in Tracy's life.
Even though there'd been these 2 presentations to hospital, I think they didn't themselves regard this very seriously. I can't see how they could have done, because they didn't seem to show the level of curiosity, the level of professionalism or investigatory prowess that you might have expected. The police had the opportunity in a formal environment. You caution someone when you're asking people information under caution. They are the investigatory arm that could have gone unannounced, could have gone to had access to that home. They could have at an early stage found out more about him.
Given the scrutiny the social workers had come under, how had such clear failings escaped the attention of the press? Tim discovered that shortly before the end of the trial, the police had held a closed-door event for reporters.
There was a police briefing about the likely impact of what had happened here, the nature of the people involved, and who was likely to be blamed. And certainly colleagues told me that there was a very firm impression coming from the police at this briefing that it was, here we go again. It's been, social workers, big problems, and it's Haringey again. Reporters report back to news desks, another Victoria Climbier, it's the same borough. It didn't take long for a narrative like that to take hold.
It's been put to me by a couple of people that the police were briefing against the social workers. Were you privy to that? Did they ever speak to you? Because I know this kind of stuff goes on naturally.
I don't really want to go into that, I don't think.
From about mid-November 2008, just felt like every time the news came on or there was something about the case, and usually about social workers and what they had and hadn't done.
In court, his main social worker, Maria Ward, admitted she'd been too willing to trust the mother's explanation for her son's injury.
You didn't hear about other people and their shortcomings. There was no balance.
Once again, a small child has been killed right under the noses of social workers. And once again, a review has been ordered into why the very people paid to protect the most vulnerable were unable to...
In the months following her sacking, Sharon Shoesmith had pored over the emergency report that had sealed her fate and destroyed the reputation of her department.
I read the inspection report and it was wrong. It was factually wrong in so many places. But I knew there was absolutely no way that I could have a voice at all. And I accepted that, I resigned myself to that. But I suppose I was shocked that no one was prepared to put their head above the parapet to say, this is wrong, this is simply not the case.
As the press continued to camp at her door, Sharon received another death threat. Her 35-year career wiped out in 3 weeks. She applied for work as a supermarket cashier, but failed to get the job.
There was certainly an occasion when I thought, I just want out of this, just want out of this. My daughters really put up a big fight to keep me going. These aren't thoughts that come to you, oh, I'll do this or I'll do that. They come to you in a different way. They just sort of emerge out of your skin, you know, and you start to think, because they were suffering so much as well, and I started to think, all three of us. All three of us. And there's a time when you kind of, for a moment, you can understand how people wipe their whole families out, because your pain is their pain, you know, and their pain is your pain, and you just want to get rid of all the pain for everybody, you know, and just, yeah, done.
What kept Sharon going was her belief that she and the social workers had been victims of an injustice. She was told by her lawyers she couldn't challenge the contents of the report. So she embarked on a 2-year legal battle to prove that she'd been unfairly dismissed, which might also reveal what, if anything, had gone on behind the scenes. She wasn't alone in believing something wasn't quite right. Tim Donovan had discovered, contrary to media reports, that health professionals had by far the most contact with Peter. There had been numerous trips to hospital and the GP, and the final assessment by Al Zayat. While trying to find out more, he stumbled across the story of Kim Holt, a doctor who'd been working at St Anne's.
These things couldn't be, could they, completely unrelated. A former consultant at the same clinic, had clearly been off for quite a long period of time, in dispute with the hospital and with the health service. Been in the same clinic where a few months, a year later, the child died. That was a trigger, which maybe kind of go back to basics, I suppose, and argue, what do I know about the health services problems at this clinic in Haringey, and what do I know about Great Ormond Street? Why are Great Ormond Street in that borough, which I had no idea about at all? I remember an NHS London spokesperson saying, this is nothing to do with baby Peter, that has well been, been dealt with, it is completely unrelated. And I suppose, counterintuitively, sometimes you think, well, can that be the case? Or the fact that one was being told that so clearly, it was worth checking.
Tim tracked down the consultant Kim Holt. She told him the story of St Anne's and how she'd gone on stress-related sick leave. Then she told him about a meeting she'd had after Peter's story broke with her employer's legal team.
Great Ormond Street lawyers walked in and said they took it very seriously, the concerns that I'd been raising. They'd looked at all the evidence and that they felt that it was impossible for me to go back to St Anne's. They'd like to offer me some money. They were trying to get me to retract my concerns, sign a confidentiality agreement and take £120,000 for doing it. The wording is pretty clear that you don't talk about St Anne's, you don't talk about Haringey, you don't talk about any of your employment with Great Ormond Street. The penny dropped. This is not just about a disagreement that I'm having with my employer. This is about Great Ormond Street. Great Ormond Street took on a community service. They've messed up and they don't want people to know.
Tim learned from Kim that for 2 years the doctors had warned management at St Anne's and then at Great Ormond Street Hospital that the clinic could not keep children safe. Donovan wondered how this crucial fact had never emerged.
And tried to find anything that had been written in relation to baby Peter, in relation to that clinic. Suddenly there was a report mentioned, known subsequently as the Seibert report, that was nowhere to be found. Quite logically, I suppose, one wondered what was in a report that meant that it hadn't been published or meant that we didn't know, exactly what it signified or what it had done. When I asked, I was told at the time, it has fed in already to this serious case review. When I looked at the beginning of this report, there were a few paragraphs. They had been written in the third person. It was just a weird little hunch. Potentially there must have been something else. When I finally got hold of the full report, it appeared that half of this report had not been part of this serious case review. But what was missing from the edited version that had gone to the official inquiry was a raft of material about problems, issues at the clinic itself. And there was this crucial section in which the head of the clinic at the time had described it to Professor Seibert as clinically risky. One can only have imagined what an official inquiry and the writers of a serious case review would have made if told about it.
It was the summer of 2010 before we actually got to see the full report. But when I did see the full report, I was absolutely shocked that we had not been provided with further information about what had been going on, all the contributory factors that led to Dr. Al-Zayat being in that position that day, without full information, without full support, without full having been adequately trained, and probably should not have been appointed to that role initially. And that actually this had all been in a report, but had actually been removed before it got to us. And that seems outrageous.
The situation at St Anne's wasn't the only information that failed to emerge about Sabah Al-Zayat's examination of Peter. It had been widely reported after the trial that Sabah had missed Peter's broken back. In fact, there had been disagreement among the medical experts who testified on the timing of the injury. To prepare for a General Medical Council hearing to consider whether she was fit to practice, an independent pathologist was asked to review Peter's case, including the timing of the broken back.
Whereas the fractures in his ribs clearly showed evidence of healing, were a number of days old, possibly a week or more old, the fracture in his spine didn't show more than very minimal evidence of a response to the injury. The bleeding around the spine as a result of the damaged blood vessels when the spine was broken appeared to be relatively fresh. The pathology evidence, certainly from the bone and the soft tissues around the bone, suggested that it was probably a bit more recent injury, that it had happened within probably 24 hours or so of his death. It seems, if you put everything together, that assault happened after he was seen by Dr. Al-Zayat. Could have been later the same day, it could have been early the next day, but it seems most likely that it happened afterwards and when he suffered this fatal assault.
The GMC would never hear this evidence. In the 15 months since the story broke, Sabah had rarely left her house. Pursued by the press and unable to work, she'd started to weep for her mother and a return to her native land. In the weeks leading up to the General Medical Council hearing, her husband had worried more and more.
She distanced herself from the two kids who were there with us, and she had begun to talk to me on things that she wanted me to do in their upbringing and all those things. You only say that when you have made up your mind that you are not going to be there anymore. She had visited 3 nearest railway stations to her house. What she was contemplating was quite evident. To take her own life. The situation became beyond my capacity to protect or help her in any way. All that I could think was any place on planet Earth would be a far, far safer place for Saba than where she was. The kids kissed their mother goodbye, and I did that. Once she went back home, she was admitted into the psychiatric unit and she was kept on suicide watch. That's what they did.
Eight months after fleeing the country, Saba Al-Zayat asked to be removed from the UK medical register. At the hearing to consider her request, psychiatrists advised that her breakdown was likely to be permanent.
Sharon Shoesmith has won her appeal against her dismissal.
Are you aghast at her nerve? Are you amazed at her determination? What do you mean?
I'm incandescent about this. This is an absolute obscenity.
I don't know where to start, to be honest with you. It just makes me so angry. This is how...
In May 2011, after 2.5 years without a job, Sharon Shoesmith won her case against the Secretary of State and Haringey Council for unfair dismissal. She received a 6-figure sum in compensation.
About being dismissed when under her watch.
But Sharon knew that this had failed to clear her name because Ofsted's devastating report remained unchallenged.
It doesn't mean that she's been vindicated in any way, shape or form for this dead baby.
But the case had uncovered something. Numerous memos and emails between Ofsted and Balls's officials and 17 drafts of the emergency report, all written during the 3 weeks of media frenzy. For Sharon, they raised serious questions about Ofsted.
I have to say I had high regard for Ofsted, high regard for its inspectors. I'd been an inspector myself. I knew the standards that we worked to. I knew the level of independence that we worked to. The government never saw reports or interfered in processes that I experienced. But this report had been steered along into that shape within Ofsted before it got published. To see the amount of manipulation that went into producing that report was really quite devastating. Draft after draft made slightly more negative than the one before. It was shaped and moved out of the hands of the Ofsted inspectors and into the hands of senior staff, very senior staff. How could senior staff write a report for an inspection they were never part of? That's utterly unheard of in Ofsted practice, utterly unheard of. It's that so-called evidence that's used to remove me.
Sharon is not the only person raising questions about Ofsted. A few days before the Baby P story broke, Ofsted was nearing the end of its 2008 assessment of the borough. Someone who claims to have inside knowledge of that assessment has now come forward.
I've never gone public with my story, and I'm not looking for people to lose jobs or anything else. But I think there were senior people within Ofsted who have never been held accountable for Ofsted's behaviour around the Baby P case.
The inspector claims to have seen Haringey's provisional grade and the documentation that backed it up.
Haringey had received a visit and it had been graded a 3 overall, which had been a judgment of good. The story broke. As the days progressed, I took the opportunity to go back to look at the information that was held on the electronic file. What concerned me greatly was to find that the original assessment documentation had disappeared.
Ofsted had suspended the assessment when the emergency inspection was announced. When it was finally published 9 days after Shoesmith's sacking, the grade had moved from a 3, good, to a 1, inadequate. The inspector claims that the original documentation that they'd seen never reappeared.
I don't know who made the decision to delete those files, but if you remove that information, you remove your accountability. I thought that was a cover-up.
Ofsted says the provisional grade for this 2008 desktop assessment was changed to take into account the findings of the emergency inspection. And this was in accordance with published policy. It completely refutes the allegation that it manipulated the process. But for the inspector, their perception of Ofsted's conduct around the assessment raises serious questions about how independent Ed Balls's emergency inspection had been.
It all happened at a time of massive political pressure. I can't get away from the fact that that impacted that inspection. I think the pressure would have been so immense that to come out with a judgment anything other would be a very, very brave thing to do.
Ofsted strenuously denied that it bowed to any pressure and states that its emergency inspection was fully independent. The inspection's damning report came at the end of 21 days of media condemnation and public outcry. Those days had been at odds with Sharon Shoesmith's experience in the 15 months before the story broke and became a national scandal.
There was a constant and regular interaction with the government, and at no time did anyone suggest that this was incompetence in Haringey, or it was incompetence on the social worker's behalf or on mine. At the same time, of course, we have Ofsted continuing with their programme of inspections, telling us we'd improved, it was good, there was no issue whatsoever. And there was no problem at all with the government until after that incident at Prime Minister's Question Time.
It's about a boyfriend who couldn't read but could beat a child, and it's about a social services department that gets £100 million a year and can't look after children. That's what it's about.
Within 24 hours, some way or other, they had to have this thing, on my head, and they had to have me out.
The buck doesn't seem to have stopped with anybody here. Nobody's put their hand up, and nobody is taking...
I will not hesitate to act on the findings of what
The fact that I didn't resign meant that I had to be got rid of in some other way. They squashed me out in the end. They sacked me. They found a way of doing what they did.
Overall, the inspector's findings are, I have to say, devastating. And Haringey Council will now remove the current Director of Children's Services from her post with immediate effect.
If there's any suggestion that the independent Ofsted inspection wasn't independent, objective and separate from me and my department, well, I'd like to see the evidence, but in my judgment that wasn't true at all. At no point did we intervene in the inspection. I resisted for weeks pressure to scapegoat an individual and said that I was going to instead have a proper, objective, independent assessment done. The idea that this was politically hurried partial or unfair is entirely without foundation as far as I'm concerned.
"7 years since his death, questions still linger around the Baby P story. But we now know that the story was far more complicated than we were led to believe, and perhaps why we turned on individuals in the way that we did.
You found yourself wishing or wondering whether any individual, any political figure, any institution would have the courage, the single-mindedness to say, this stops now, actually. You know, the blame, you know, we're not going to hide failings or mistakes or errors. We know it's a motive. We know this was a terrible tragedy, but to stand up and say, you know, we cannot carry on blaming this social worker or this frontline doctor. We've got to be grown up, and we have to accept there is a reality that this will happen, and that we can move towards putting in preventative measures in future to make it less likely. Will never eradicate the possibility it's going to happen.
Never been so surprised and taken back and horrified by what happened in this country, and particularly in London at that time. Instead of sorrow, it was anger, and it was anger that was looking for who to blame. And rather than it looking at the people who actually hurt this child, it was actually somehow feeling that we must be able to, we as human beings cannot do this. There must be a way we can be stopped, and somehow the people that should be stopping it must be the ones to blame.
Of all the 10 years that I chaired the Education and Children's School Select Committee, I think it's the Baby Peter case and the way in which Sharon Shoesmith was subsequently treated still haunts me. It was politicians behaving very badly. The media and that feeding frenzy around the Baby Peter case that gave us an environment where people acted badly, and there were a lot of casualties out of that. It wasn't just Sharon Shoesmith, it was the profession of social work, it was the reputation of politicians, it was, generally the quality of our democracy. And I think something very, very bad happened, and we still haven't reflected on it and learnt the lessons.